Firmware. Firmware is a software program or set of instructions programmed on a hardware device. It's a layer between hardware and software, also called embedded software. It is non-volatile, installed on ROM chips, read-only memory chips, ROM, PROM, EPROM, or flash chips. Actually, these firmwares are used. If you have a washing machine, you have a set of instructions, and based on these instructions, actually the washing machine works. So it is like you need to give those instructions on the basis of which the washing machine works. It's the same. Firmware is the same. It is a software program or set of instructions programmed on a hardware device. Any such software program, that is known as firmware. BIOS, basic input output system, is the program a computer's microprocessor uses to start the computer system after it is powered on. The BIOS found in IBM compatible personal computers, the operating system on a router, the iPod's control menus, the Xbox 360 dashboard firmware is in every electronic device that is used. Enables the device to render its capabilities functional. Firmware coordinates the activities of the hardware during normal operation and contains programming constructs used to perform those operations. In a typical modem, the firmware will be a factor in establishing the modem's data rate, command set recognition, and special feature implementation. Developed using low-level programming languages or machine language, the developmental cycles are complicated as regular software development. Developers must have deep understanding of the hardware of the product as well as the programming skills, and it must be well tested. These firmwares were never upgradable. So once we were using the firmware and whenever it couldn't be rewritten. So when the BIOS became outdated, the only option was to buy a new motherboard. But nowadays most firmwares can be updated, and this upgradable function is one of the advantages of firmware because it is stored in flash memory. You can upgrade it, and flashing firmware is also risky as the device will not boot if the flashing process is interrupted or becomes corrupted. One of the most common devices to have regular firmware updates are recording devices such as optical media writers, DVD, CD, HD, DVD, and Blu-ray. And in the past, most devices they run on their own firmware. Over the years, manufacturers have found that loading the firmware from the host system is both cheaper and more flexible. As a result, much current hardware is unable to function in any useful way until the host computer has fed it the requisite firmware. This firmware load is handled by the device driver. That is why it is showing whenever a device is connected, the device has to run. So actually the device is getting compatible with the computer, and this is done by the firmware. Devices like the wireless card, Intel Pro Wireless 2200 BG, the driver is in the Linux kernel, but you have to put the firmware into lib of firmware before you can use the device. And in Linux there is a folder for firmware, and firmware goes open source, that is firmware for Linksys router, Linux BIOS, which is an open BIOS. BIOS is actually basic input output system. Firmware code run by an IBM compatible PC runs when the computer is powered on. It's basic input output system. Whatever input and output is devices are attached that need to work. And it initializes several motherboard components and peripherals including processors and caches, chipset, memory, graphics controller, mass storage controllers, various input output controllers. Finally, it loads a bootloader for the operating system and transfers control to it. So all the BIOS has its own. Uh, there is for any external device there is its own firmware, and later the firmware, once firmware initiates the starting of the device, what happens is the booter takes control, the booting system takes control, and then the operating system takes control of the uh, device. If you are attaching if you have connected your printer, once you're on the printer, you hear some sound that it is getting it's becoming on. Actually that is working, there it is working, its firmware is working and connecting it to the system. Recently, the BIOS has taken on more complex functions such as power management, hot swapping, and thermal management. An extensible firmware interface was invented to extend BIOS functionality while reducing the complexity. Open source efforts like Linux by Open BIOS are example